The Arc de Triomphe in France celebrates a war in which countless people were sent to die. The Gettysburg War Memorial in the United States celebrates a war in which brother fought against brother. The Vietnam War Memorial celebrates a war in which people were sent to another country that they did not know without their consent to kill civilians who did not want to be there in the first place. Under any other situation in the world, we would condemn these immediately. But because they are related to our nations, we commemorate them. Because we believe that violence violates our values, we are proud to propose the motion, this House would stop commemorating wars. What I'm going to do in today's speech is quite simple. First, I'm going to present first I'm going to go into the issue of framing and explain exactly what it is that side proposition stands for. Second, I'm going to go into two substantive arguments for side proposition. That first of all, commemoration glorifies violence, and second of all, commemoration creates history written by the victor. Our third argument will go into our third substantive. But I want to clarify framing very clearly, because this is a motion that is at its base both core and principle and requires a very clear understanding of what we're going to do. So I want to ask a few questions. First of all, what does it mean to commemorate a war? We think that this is things like building monuments, creating national holidays, or large awards that are designed to celebrate certain aspects of a war publicly. We question who commemorates wars. We think that this is governments almost exclusively. Why? Because they're the ones that have the money and the public responsibility to feel that they need to commemorate the wars. We think they're the ones that we're going to be addressing in today's round. So what do we propose? We think that we should have a system relatively similar to Japan, where government would stop celebrating wars with things like monuments and national holidays. Other large public displays that are related to war would also be banned. We think that what would happen instead is study of these wars from multiple fact-based perspectives. And this is going to be key. We'd like to point out furthermore, how is academia different from commemoration? We'd say that commemoration is something that exists particularly when you're trying to celebrate certain aspects of the war. While it may include facts, it certainly doesn't include very many different opinions, certainly doesn't include very many different perspectives. It's designed to paint a country within the best possible light. We think differently when you're having academic study. It's something that's more focused towards actually getting the facts about what happened and designing what you're going to do surrounding it. Yes?
Do you believe that these two are mutually exclusive? If they are, and if they aren't, please elaborate on that.
Actually, we're going to get into that in the second argument, so listen closely. But before, we just want to say, even if they're not mutually exclusive, if there are several harms that come particularly from commemoration, we still shouldn't do them. So, let's talk about the first substantive beside government. This is that commemoration glorifies violence. We'd say that government will remember violence, particularly war, in a positive light. Here's the specific link analysis that gets us to that conclusion. We tell you the governments are most often the ones responsible for a war. They're the ones who make the decision to send people off to war. They're the ones who make foreign policy choices. They're the ones who are ultimately responsible when your son, when your daughter, when your brother, when your sister, and when your neighbor dies. We'd say that if there was war that was considered bad by society, if it's something that was considered not worth it, then government is admitting a systemic fault. At this point, the government becomes illegitimate in the eyes of the public. That's something that clearly a self-interested government, one that's trying to remain in power, is not going to want. So they're going to attempt to do their best to commemorate war in a positive light. Why is this problematic? There are a few problems. The first is a principle layer. We tell you that violence at its base ought to be rejected. That the most basic of human integrity is to say that we ought not have violence against one another. But we think furthermore, how we remember the violence, specifically within the context of war, is important. We say oftentimes we glorify war, we glorify the fact that people are going off towards fighting, and that violence is brought upon them. And we glorify the practices that get them there. In fact, we say that whenever you're commemorating something, you actually produce and propagandize their sacrifice. Why is this problematic? Because oftentimes it doesn't happen without the specific consent of the people who go to war. Things like the draft force people to go to war. People don't understand what they're signing up for when they go to war. And then when their lives are lost, those lives, their loss, is used in a cycle of propaganda that sends more people off to war. This brings us to the second impact that we think is particularly important in today's round, and that is the practical. We think what happens when you have a society that has normalized and glorified violence by commemorating wars is that they're more likely to tacitly accept it. We think the fact is, when you think that violence is normal, when you think it's something honorable, when you think it's something that a country normally engages in, and should in fact be celebrated, what often happens is that people are more willing to engage in that violent activity. That means when the government chooses to go off to war, the people will support them. That means the people might call for violence on their own. We think all of these allow us to commit even more violence and contributes to a cycle of militarization that we will not stand for on team government. The second substantive argument that we're going to be engaging with today is going to directly answer the point of information that we just heard from the opposition, is that commemoration creates a history that is written by the victor. This is the part answering their point of information. We tell them that commemoration contributes to cultural memory much more than academia does. Why? Because something that you would listen to in school is going to fade over time. But but the problem is, something that you have learning and you see every day, every year, like a national holiday, is going to continually be there. So if you have a commemoration that is always glorifying this war, then the history is going to be written by the victor. The loser isn't going to have the right to write the history. We think that's going to be inherently problematic. Yes, ma'am.
Why do you claim that simply because one country, let's take the case that really it is that they glorify just their victims, why do you believe that that is exclusive with another country glorifying theirs?
We're saying that the problem here is we're talking about just within a specific country, right? I don't go to the war memorials of other countries that often. I certainly don't celebrate their national holidays. This is the context within societies operate. Moreover, we tell you that when we're talking about history being written by the victors, it's often exclusive. We only hear the narrative of that victor, which means that we're not actually understanding what happened. On a principle level about education, what we're getting is an incomplete story. But more importantly, we're actually able to learn from this. We simply get a raw patriotic version of the story that can actually lead us into even worse results. Moreover, it harms the history of the country present because you don't actually get a diversified history. You hear that all of this war happened with everyone united together under the common country, but they were often forced to. Oftentimes they came without rights. For example, the African Americans in the United States who were forced to go to war and then return home to a country where they were still segregated, where their rights were still systemically denied from them, and yet they are shown in war memorials as the faces fighting for the United States, or not shown at all because they were replaced by white people. We think all of these are problematic examples where academic study is superseded by a commemoration that is systemically exclusive of several perspectives. So, just to go over exactly what we told you today, we said firstly that violence violates our values. We say that commemoration glorifies this violence because whatever you're doing it, you're painting it in a positive light. And we told you that this overcomes the academic study that is actually valuable. It is for this reason that we've been proud to propose.
Okay, thank you for this fine speech. We'll continue with a response from side opposition.
Wait. Okay. I'm so sorry. Speaker, there has been a great mischaracterization of what war commemorations actually look like in the real world. War commemorations are not something that inherently celebrates violence and inherently perpetuates violence in a society. War commemorations celebrate the end of war, celebrate the end of violence, and celebrate the peace that was brought by the end of war. This is something that the side of the opposition proudly stands for in this debate. Something that we will justify by offering 3 substantive points. Firstly, we're going to talk about how commemorations serve as a reminder to the society. Secondly, we're going to talk about how it brings people together and about the benefits of those. And thirdly, our second speaker will talk about closure for the victims, etc. But before we get into our constructive, let's just deal with their case before that. 2 points of rebuttal. Firstly, considering their whole point, how commemorations inherently celebrate violence and how it perpetuates violence in the society. First question we have, what does real commemoration actually look like? We don't believe that commemorations of war are people standing in protest shouting, we should bring the war back, we actually glorify the violence, we actually are proud of everything that we've done. Actually, Madam Speaker, the real picture of what war commemorations actually look like in the society is exactly the opposite. We see leaders of major countries such as Angela Merkel that actually contribute to those commemorations by saying that they regret everything that happened in the past, by saying that they regret all the violence and all the harm and all the victims that war has brought. We're saying that actually commemorations are the ones that remind people of the importance of peace and all the harms that the violence brings. But even if we also say that commemorations actually don't glorify violence, but the victims that actually emerge from these violence. We say that commemorations pay tribute to those people who died for our country or for a certain cause. And we believe that that is very important, Madam Speaker, but we'll go on deeper into that in our constructive. But even if we say that those really glorify violence, which we prove that they don't, but even if we take them on their highest ground and say that that is true, we never saw a clear link how actually glorifying violence by commemoration will have an impact on the society, that you will get more violent people that will do crimes, that you will get a more violent society, that you will be more prone to conflict. We don't see how commemorating those, even if we say that those really are glorifying violence, how this will bring militarization. This is another burden that the side of the proposition has put on themselves. Now let's talk about the second point, where they told you that exactly commemoration have a bigger impact than things that we read, the things that we just listened to. We believe, Madam Speaker, that this is exactly what is important about commemoration. We believe that commemorations of war actually make it look more personal, actually have a bigger impact on the society than what they're proposing under their side of the house. So if we take their principle, if we take their analysis, it actually proves our side of the house and our cause. We told you the commemoration of wars are extremely important for the benefits that we will prove in our case, but we also see the contradiction on their side of the house. Firstly, the problem with their substantive is that they, first of all, never care to analyze why is even the fact that Victor's right history a bad thing. They just said, oh, Victor's right history, that is a bad thing, other people don't get a say. First of all, we need a clear explanation, why is that a bad thing? Also, we say, how is this exactly caused by commemoration? They never linked how actually Victor's writing history in our society is caused by once a year having a holiday that actually glorifies peace brought after the war. Now we see an inherent problem with their case, with the lack of analysis, with lack of links, with just assumptions and no analysis. In order to win this debate, they need to improve on that. But also we say that on each side of the house, you still get history that is written by victors. You still get history that is written by victors. That is something that they cannot change. And we also say that we don't see an exact problem of those. While that we don't see exact problem. Okay, but let's now get into my first constructive. Well, I'll tell you that we should oppose the motion because it actually serves as a reminder of war atrocities. So I believe, Madam Speaker, that we can all very simply agree that war is something horrible and should never be repeated. All the individuals suffering, all the societies suffering, those things should never be repeated. But unfortunately, Madam Speaker, we see that in the status quo, countries tend to oftenly forget what happened in the past during those wars. And we believe that those countries should never forget the atrocities that war implemented on their society. And we believe that if they're more prone to forget, they're also more prone to conflict of any kind. Because we believe that you are less likely to involve yourself in a conflict if you're well aware of the consequences. Now, how do commemoration actually help in this? Commemoration are a very clear reminder of all the things that happen. Because they're not only like an event or a holiday, they also have a great media exposure, and a lot of people are talking about this. Now, why is this better than the alternatives? Because we say that the difference between us reading facts and commemorating is that it's far easier for us to relate to those commemorations than it is to just simple facts that we read. This is when we see the impact of these commemorations actually helping as a reminder to never repeat the war atrocities. But before I go on, a POI.
You missed the analysis that Josh provides you in the first proposition. He tells you that too often commemoration is just raw patriotism that doesn't engage in the critical analysis of why wars themselves are bad. That's what we get from academia.
No, it isn't. First of all, commemoration is not random people protesting against peace and supporting violence. And second of all, if you still want the academia, it exists on our side of the house as well. We don't see how this is mutually exclusive as we offered in our POI. But now let's get into the impact of this argument. Now, we believe that the impact is very, very clear, Madam Speaker. We believe that countries that are more aware of the consequences are much, much less likely to spark a conflict. But now let's get into our second constructive, where I'll tell you that we should oppose the motion because it brings people together over their well-being and peace. We have 2 points in this argument. First of all, we think that people today think of the state as a very abstract idea and don't really relate to it, nor they feel the responsibility towards the state. We see that people, but we feel that people should feel responsible because, first of all, of everything the state did for them in order to protect them through the war, and second of all, because even in the status quo, even if we neglect the war thing, it still gives them social benefits, it still creates their security. Now, why is this a responsibility important, Madam Speaker? Because people who feel responsible are much more likely to be more productive in the society, to contribute to the society more. Now, we say that this is where commemoration actually helps, because it creates cohesion in the society. And once you have this cohesion in the society, where people unite over what happened in the past and try to bring peace also in the long run, that's when you get a more stable society. That's when you get people united over the idea of peace and united over the idea that we should keep on, that we should forget, that we should not perpetuate violence. But second point of this argument says that during the tough times of the state, it's very important that we have this cohesion. Now, this is really important also, because this cohesion brings people closer together, and it reminds them through these commemorations that even when times are tough, people should not just give up when it tells them that there is hope that things will get better. And we believe that that is a very important impact, Madam Speaker, in our case. So what have I proven to you in this debate? First of all, not only that we've proven substantial benefits and analyzed how they have no harms on their side of the house, but also due to a great mischaracterization of commemoration, the side of the opposition has already won this debate.
Okay, thank you for the fine speech. We'll now continue with the second speaker from side proposition.
I find it rather curious that the
first opposition speaker tells us that we don't have a conception of what a war memorial or commemorating looks like, when throughout 8 minutes of her speech, she fails to provide you at least one example of what commemoration would actually positively look like on their side of the house. 3 things in this speech. What I'm going to do firstly is engage with the material we just heard. After that, rebuild upon what Josh told you. Finally, I'm going to bring up our final argument, which is the idea of commemorating war reinforces a soldier culture on the individual level with people. But let's talk about the opposition's case first, respond to that in conjunction with these ideas of framing. So here's what they tell you. They essentially say that in response to our model, that it's not mutually exclusive to have the idea of academic critiques in addition to the idea of having commemoration. But this is what Josh tells you. He says that even if they're not mutually exclusive, if we can prove to you that a world in which they both exist is net worse, then we can prove that getting rid of these commemorations will actually be better. Why is this true? Josh does this really clearly. He tells you that academic study and the critique of what actually happens, what actually instills the knowledge of war, is diluted over time by these extravagant celebrations that glorify war and often miss the actual point of what's going to happen. So additionally, what we say is even if there are some instances in which these commemorations are going to be good, on the whole we tell you that most of these instances of commemoration are actually diluting the principle of what it ought to be, and that in conjunction with the idea of academic study is what we ought to be looking to. So they don't get enough engagement with the actual intricacies of the model that Josh tells you, the idea of this is what's happening in Japan right now in this current instance. So the first argument that they bring to you on the opposition, we have major 2 points of rebuttal today on their case. What they try to tell you is this idea of how war memorials and commemoration is the only way that we can actually be reminded of atrocity. We say, no, this is simply not true. We say, through the idea, the best way we can actually learn about atrocity is not through simply looking at whatever the government builds or shows us as what should actually happen. It's an engagement in the critical analysis and study of that monument. So when she tries to tell you that they're not going to involve themselves in the future, we'd say, look to the example of Germany, for example, which they actually focus a lot on the idea of the academic study is the heavy emphasis of World War II, for example, which I'll have you know actually gets spread more around the world. So this emphasis on academic study, not simply a building, is what actually allows people to understand what's happening. Additionally, what they tell you is that, well, leaders are able to denounce things through commemoration. Well, I mean, that's not really relevant in the sense that a leader can still denounce certain atrocities without having to build a monument to do it anyway. They can give a speech or something like that. So the second point of rebuttal we're going to talk to you about today is this idea, what they tell you when you bring people together. And this is actually in direct contention with the second argument Josh brings you, because we actually say it is rather the opposite. This is the same logic that says you should be grateful for what the country has done for you. It is the same logic that says when Black Americans came back to fight from wars back that they were drafted into illegally, they came back to a country that did not defend their rights. Right now, trans people in the United States go into war and come back to a country that does not defend their rights, but because we have these commemorations through monuments, through the glorified propagandization that Josh tells you about of these monuments, we see the erasure of these identities and the erasure of what actually makes up the constituency and the population of these people that these monuments are so-called there to actually support. Let's talk about the proposition case, because we hear a variety of things in the last speech. So our first argument is this idea from principally we ought not be doing things that actually help us to glorify violence. So here's what we tell you. Essentially, they say that no, war commemoration is not about glorifying violence, it is about peace. But I would task them in their next speech to actually give you some examples of how this is true, because a world in which we can point to, for example, Confederate monuments in the South in the United States, which still fly the Confederate flag and still tell people they should go out and propagate violence, that's not good. If you can look to certain monuments in Israel, for example, which falsely talk about only one side of the Yom Kippur War, for example, which only give one side of this story, we said that actually still propagates a culture that is surrounded by militarism, regardless of your opinion on it. We can say, look to examples in France, where there's literally a national holiday that's dedicated to the colonization of a certain island in Africa. These are not this is not commemoration that is actually striving to have reconciliation or having a cathartic means to it. This is commemoration that, regardless of its intent, results in the violence that we see in the society. But let's talk additionally about the second argument that we have, about how it creates a history that's written by the victor and why that's bad. The only response we hear is no link. Well, here's what the link that Josh articulates. He says that when we have a culture that is surrounded by war and that puts all of the value on war, we result in things, for example, like the United States. On the 4th of July, when they're flying military demonstrations above us to talk about the great things and commemorate war, most people in the United States look at that and say, let's send more planes into other parts of the world and continue to invade them, because there's this culture of war in the United States now that our economy is literally dependent on. That we literally have a military industrialized economy that makes it so that we have to actually only be able to look at the conflicts of war. So what do we tell you? We say that when we only see one narrative actually being presented in society, what does that do? It actually reinforces a stigma and actually reinforces the ability for people to only look at their side of the conflict, which is what creates the society of militarization. So let's go on and talk about our third argument right now, which is going to continue to engage with their material. This is the idea of soldier culture on the individual level. We say that when you live in a culture that glorifies violence and militarism by the fact that they propagate wars and they talk about them and they talk about the commemoration of it, we say that it reinforces this idea of militarism on an individual level. So when we are in a society that is constantly glorifying and celebrating, commemorating war, it means that it's constantly written by the winner, which gives an asymmetrical approach to it on the individual level for people. At that point, you're receiving an incomplete analysis of what war actually looks like. This means, in many instances, that individuals are coerced by their culture, by what they're told to, in compliance and internalize this message. This has two main impacts. One, we tell you that more people are actually going to feel and associate worth with entering into the militaries because they are fed this incomplete information about what the promises of war actually is. Note that we are not saying that we regret the idea of people going to join the military as an admirable activity. What we're telling you is when they're being fed false information by their society, by their government, that their experience is going to be romanticized or is it going to be actually as bad as it's going to be, we say that's not a principally just way that we ought to be getting people to actually engage in war. But secondly, we're going to tell you that when we see societal pressure about this, we see more people being willing to actually enter wars. And what does that result into? It results in examples like the United States, where we point to our disposable military of mass numbers of people and do just that. We treat our military like disposable, and we treat these people like they're not, where they're just commodities in this militaristic machine because they are so entranced in this culture that coerces them into this idea of coming into the government, into the military rather. We say that if you are surrounded by a hyper-militaristic culture that equates your value to contribute to the military and to the military complex with your value to just be like an intrinsically worthwhile person, we say that is detrimental. And that comes as a direct result from which we have these national holidays, which glorify the actual presence of war, which fly military planes over the sky without actually interrogating why we do that. We encourage Team Opposition to provide us more examples. We encourage them to engage with the model. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this fine speech. We'll continue with the second speaker from side opposition.
The main problem with side proposition today, ladies and gentlemen, is their missed focus. Is their characterization of commemorations as something that celebrates war. But ladies and gentlemen, commemorations actually celebrate peace, and they pay respect to victims, and that is exactly what we owe to them. So, in my speech today, firstly, I'm going to talk about what message about war do we send by making those commemorations, and then I'm going to talk some more about the character of those commemorations. Then I'm going to lay out our third substantive about closure for victims and why it is so important for us. Okay. Firstly, about the message we send about war. Okay, they tell us that if we have commemorations, we take away some of the influence that academia has. Three responses to this. Okay, the first one, the message that academia sends actually dilutes with time either way. Because if you only read about those things that happened in your textbooks, if you only know the facts about them, you eventually stop caring about them. So that actually happens independently of whether we have those commemorations or not. But our second response, much more important, is that we show you that it is better to have some sort of an outlet to identify with the things that happened in that war, because that is actually what shows us what is the real nonsensity of war. What is the real thing that we should never let happen again. Ladies and gentlemen, commemorations show us not only our own victims, they show us what happened on the other side. We have international commemorations. We have commemorations that denounce exactly what the country has done in the war. They asked us for examples. We have examples. We have examples of that. Those are commemorations about the Holocaust. Of course, no one celebrates the Holocaust. We are just trying to remind you that that is something that is never to happen again, and that is something that we should all denounce very publicly and very clearly. Essentially, if you have a more personal way of identifying with the message that is being sent about that war, you are more likely to reject it. You are more likely to really comprehend what is so horrible about those wars that we never want to repeat them again. And commemorations show not only the facts about what happened, they talk about some very personal things. They talk about how they actually talk about how in wars brothers turned against brothers, and that is what shows us why it is something so nonsensical, something that shouldn't happen again. And three, okay, let's take them at their highest ground, even if we admit that it completely changes the narrative of the war, that the victors actually write the history. What is the impact of that? We actually think that that countries have the right and should talk about their victims, and they have the right to pay respects to them, to pay respects to the victims that happened. Of course, even if we talk about that those countries sent people to war without their consent, well, then that is exactly what we owe to them, to talk about their victims, to talk about why is that something that shouldn't have happened, why is that our mistake, and why is that something that shouldn't happen again. Yes, please.
Can you explain to me how it's morally just from a principle standpoint for France to have a national holiday which literally commemorates the exploitation and colonization of Africa?
Okay, that is something that we don't stand for, but we're talking about commemorations of wars, and we're talking about commemorations of victims that happened in those wars. So that is exactly the missed focus, that is the problem of your entire case, because you don't talk about the victims, you don't talk about what we denounce in those commemorations. Now, furthermore, also they asked us for examples on how do those peaceful commemorations exist. Well, you go and pay respects in cemeteries. You go and meet with other international leaders. You talk about the things that happened. You try to find a way for that to not happen again, to restore a dialogue that happened. No, thank you. I already talked about international commemorations that do happen, that do send a clear message of what are the values that we're trying to uphold in our own society. And commemorations celebrate those victims, they celebrate peace, and they celebrate independence. Not war, not conflict, not violence. And on the point of radicalization and how we actually how we glorify war. Only this way, if we have that much of a large scale that we can affect people on, that is the only way we can actually denounce those radicals. That is the only way we can show that that is something we do not agree with on a huge scale, because those events actually attract attention of thousands of people. And just imagine, okay, yes, public leaders can denounce wars in their speeches or whatever, but just imagine how much bigger of an impact does it have if they actually do it publicly in front of thousands of people, in front of the eyes of the public. No, thank you. And now to go on to my third constructive about the closure for victims. No, thank you. Okay, we're talking about people who lost a loved one in war, who managed to escape the war, be it as soldiers, be it as civilians, people who survived those atrocities. And what do commemorations mean for those people? Firstly, it means some kind of closure for victims. Because, okay, of course, although they can never get back what they lost, they can never get back their loved ones or the parts of the lives they lost, but they can find comfort in the fact that now maybe that victim wasn't completely pointless, because as we already showed you, those commemorations show us that that is something that should never be repeated again. And that way they can find some kind of sense in what happened. They can find some kind of comfort. They can find some kind of peace in the fact that it has served some kind of a purpose. And we've talked to you about educating new generations and about reminding them about the atrocities of war. But the second thing, also important, is showing admiration and compassion for those victims. By holding these commemorations, we show the victims that we value and admire the fact that they contributed to our freedom, that they contributed to the fact that we are now able to live independently, to have all the rights that we fought for in that war. And that is something that means a lot to them, because we show admiration and compassion on a huge scale. You get support from thousands of people. You get the view of thousands of people marching in a parade, showing that that is something that we value a lot. And all of this is extremely important for them because they're able to go on more easily with their lives. So, in my speech today, I have shown you what is the real message those commemorations show about war. I showed you what is the real character of them, how we have international commemorations and things that denounce war, and I talked to you about closure for victims, and for all of these reasons, we beg you to oppose it.
Can I have the head? The one with the blue head. This one? Under the blue head, yeah.
Thank you so much.
When Liz asked in her POI in the last opposition, is basically she asked, is it okay to commemorate France basically colonizing Africa? And Team Opposition rightly says, no, that's something we agree with. But here's the problem. Team Opposition then says, well, that isn't war, and I have to ask, does Team Opposition really not think that France engaging in imperialism and colonizing Africa does not constitute a war, does not constitute overreach, does not constitute a military invasion of a sovereign country? At that point, we literally tell you that commemoration of war only glorifies violence, only glorifies imperialism and colonialism, and at that point we tell you that Team Proposition is stronger both on the principle and practical level. So today what I'll be doing is, first I'll be asking two clarification questions. I'll clarify what commemoration looks like and what the comparative looks like, and then I'll be showing you why Team Proposition wins today's debate, first on a principle level and then on a practical level. So first, let's clarify what commemoration looks like. Now, Team Opposition basically say that commemoration looks like people regretting war. Now, Liz tells you in her second proposition that, well, leaders can still regret it. Angela Merkel saying that she regrets World War II happening is something that we don't disagree with under our model. But for some reason, Team Opposition didn't engage with that analysis in their last speech. Remember the model that we provide you at the beginning of Josh's proposition, when he tells you that basically what we want to do is we want to look at something like Japan, where Japan does not basically use monuments to glorify war, but instead it prefers an academic study. But let's focus on commemoration for a little bit. Basically, we see that even when you commemorate war, we see that continually The commemoration of war is the glorification of war. Liz points out on the 4th of July, you have military parades flying overhead, at the same point encouraging people to support the military overseas. Second, Josh points out in the first proposition in answer to the POI, when he points out that people are celebrating battles, not the end of the war. And third, Liz points out that the Confederate flag still flies in states in the South. That's a unique glorification of a war that was designed to protect slavery. At that point, we literally tell you that Confederate flags, that I'll take your point in a second, that the commemoration of war is uniquely harmful and detrimental. It glorifies war, and we think that's dangerous, but you disagree.
The Confederate flag doesn't fly with the approval of American government. Those are some radicals that are trying to impose that.
You'd be hilariously wrong about that, because there are literally state capitals that fly the Confederate flag. We think that's ridiculous. Look, at the point where state governments engage in that sort of commemoration, we think that they're uniquely telling the people that it's states supporting Confederate flags. At that point, we think our model solves this problem by saying that states shouldn't be building those kind of monuments. That's why we think it's good that states take down monuments of Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee. We think something like that is uniquely good and happens in a proposition world. Let's not glorify war, because that's what commemoration looks like. Now let's look at what the comparative looks like, because basically in today's debate, we're focused on we're focusing on the academia versus the commemoration. Now, in the last opposition, they basically bring up three responses, a 3-point test, no thank you, to talk about why academia is different than commemoration. They tell you first, academia dilutes over time. We say no, academia is only strengthened over time. We say that when people build upon academia in the past, we see that academia overall grows. We see that there's more critical analysis of war as time goes on, and we see that it's extremely important. Josh tells you in the beginning of Proposition 1 that it's better not to have rah-rah patriotism saying, well, the 4th of July is good, well, saying wars are good, commemorating violence. It's much better to have an analysis of war, to have a critical analysis of war. And this is the analysis that Liz uniquely points out comes with academia. She tells you that when you have academia, when you have basically a critical analysis of war, you see more about why war is actually bad, rather than just blindly supporting the military. Then their second response is that basically commemoration gives people an outlet to identify with things that happen on the other side. They talk about the Holocaust Museum. We think it's absolutely wonderful that private citizens want to commemorate humanitarian tragedies. But sadly, what we see is that far too often, the governments don't support these kinds of things. Look at the French example, where France is literally the national government of France commemorates colonizing Africa. At that point, we think it's uniquely harmful that the government engages in practices that private organizations don't. Look, we think the Holocaust Museum is a wonderful way to show that basically victims are cared about. We think it's a wonderful way for us to make change, but sadly, governments don't do it. Governments commemorate violence. They don't commemorate change. And the third point is about personal stories. And we're going to talk about this again basically with a private example. Look, governments don't they don't commemorate personal stories. They commemorate war. They commemorate violence. And here's the real problem, and it's what Josh and Liz both point out to you. They commemorate basically in military that they treat as unified. And Josh brings up to you this analysis, this beautiful analysis in the first proposition, when he tells you that basically what happens in the Vietnam War Memorial is that the American government commemorates all soldiers as serving, all soldiers as wanting to serve. But sadly, and here's the problem, none of those soldiers wanted to serve. They were drafted into a war that they didn't support, that they didn't fight for, and sadly they were killed because of it. Here's the problem. Team Opposition brings up their analysis. I'll take your point in a second. Team Opposition brings up this analysis in the third argument, where they basically tell you that families like war memorials, but that's not true. Here's why. Families in the United States, especially, when they see Vietnam War memorials, they dislike their loved ones being used as commodities to influence the future of war. They dislike their people who basically didn't support the war in the first place being used as objects in order to basically glorify war in the future. That's what we think is harmful, but you disagree.
Don't we owe it to those people who were sent to war unjustly to commemorate their victim, to show people that we value their victim?
We owe it to those people not to rush to war in the first place. We owe it to those people to make sure that they don't have to sacrifice themselves. Because sadly, the government that drafts people into submission, a government that drafts people into a military that they don't want to fight for, is a product of this commemoration that we uniquely state. Look, Josh and Zisco told you and have told you throughout today's entire debate that when you commemorate war, you increase a militaristic culture. And at that point, you're literally sending more people to war. I'd rather have there not be war in the first place. And that's the analysis that team proposition helps you with. So now let's see why today we're winning on principle. Sadly, the opposition never actually provides a strong principle argument in today's debate. So let's examine what the proposition principle is and how basically it's evolved throughout this debate. So we say in the first proposition, violence at its base ought to be rejected. So when you glorify violence, we think you ought to reject that. But second, we tell you in the second proposition argument that when you erase people's history, when you treat militaries as a unified body even though they aren't, when you treat people as supporting war even though they didn't, we see that's erasing them and it's erasing their values. And at that point, you're also erasing the values of the other people who didn't fight in the conflict. They say that the governments commemorate basically people, the governments commemorate the other side. We have yet to see a single example for them aside from the Holocaust Museum, and we tell you that we love private people to do the same thing, but governments simply aren't doing that. We need governments to actually commemorate change, not to commemorate violence, but that's what they're doing in the status quo, and that's why we think it's principally wrong. But the second is the practical argument in today's debate, and that's the big one here. Look, at the point where we tell you that a more militaristic culture creates more war, at the point where we tell you that a more militaristic culture tells people that they have to serve in the army or else they're not worthy, at the point where we tell you that this commemoration of war glorifies violence, creates this militaristic culture, and just makes a worse world to live in, that's worse on the practical, and that's worse on the principle. Look, at the end of today's debate, we think that when you commemorate war, you glorify violence. You create a culture in which people are told they have to serve in order to succeed. And sadly, we think that this is dangerous. Let's not coerce people into compliance with this culture. Let's not coerce people into fighting wars they never wanted to fight. And let's propose today's motion.
Thank you for the fine speech. We'll continue with the third speaker from side.
Always forgive, but never forget. This is a term and a line that exists all over the world in various languages. And this is the line that we proudly stand for, and side proposition never understood the importance of this line and how it is present all over the world in all of these commemorations. Today, what I'm going to do is analyze this debate through two main clashes, two main points. The first, and a very important one, which we dealt with throughout the bench, was the nature of these commemorations and what did they actually impose and what do we actually see in these commemorations and why are they not as the side proposition claims they are. But secondly, also a very important point is how they influence the society. Do they create a more radical society? Do they create a more aware society of the issues of war and such? This is what we're going to analyze. But before all this, we need to actually establish a very simple premise that side proposition made wrong. They believe that countries that were aggressors celebrate their aggression. They believe that, for example, Germany celebrates World War II, that it commemorates it in a good way. This is how they portray this debate. This is not what the debate is about, and this is not what is actually happening. And this actually is an introduction into this whole point about the nature of commemorations. Now, we believe that we can actually split its nature into 2 points: what they glorify and what they mourn. First, let's talk about what they glorify. They glorify peace and they glorify independence. Not once has a commemoration glorified violence, glorified Holocaust, glorified genocide. This has never